Hey, everybody. So this week in the United States, President Donald Trump signed several new executive orders. Two of the executive orders are diametrically opposed to one another. And so I'm really curious as to who's helping to shape some of the policy coming out of the White House, particularly as it concerns issues of African American policymaking. Because one of the new executive orders is designed to enhance the work of HBCUs, and the other is a rebuke to the notion as to why HBCUs really exist in the first place. And so my name is Monica Maybank, and this is the Holy Politician Podcast. On this podcast, we discuss politics, policy, and culture through the lens of truth and holiness. If you haven't subscribed, I'd encourage you to subscribe by clicking that button now. And so just yesterday, the POTUS sat at the Resolute desk and signed two new executive orders that have implications for Black America. And so I want to provide a brief description of what these EOs do and how there is a clear lack of understanding amongst some people on the president's policy team on the implications of some of these policy directives. And so the first executive order is the White House initiative to promote excellence and innovation at historically Black colleges and universities. And this EO or executive order is really a continuation of the president's first administration when he made a commitment to increase funding for HBCUs. And so this EO serves two main functions. One, to increase the private sector role in strengthening HBCUs. And then two, to enhance HBCU programming to include things like partnering with private entities and elementary and secondary education stakeholders to build a pipeline for students out of elementary school and high school to HBCUs, which sounds like a great idea. Improving the availability and quality of information concerning HBCUs in the public policy space, and then encouraging states to provide the required state matching funds to these land grant institutions, which are what historically Black colleges and universities are. And so that's what an HBCU is, a historically Black college university. And all of these policies sound great, right? They sound like great policies to encourage the promotion of these schools. Now, do we know why these schools exist in the first place? Well, in the 1800s, post-slavery, Blacks had to crawl and scratch their way into college because they weren't granted an opportunity to attend colleges where traditional folks or white Americans were going to school because of discrimination, et cetera. And so there were several federal laws and state laws that were passed that created separate institutions of higher learning for Black Americans, like my alma mater, Howard University, which was created in 1867, and more than 100 other historically Black colleges and universities across the nation, really. So today, even though these schools exist, they have fewer resources than traditional colleges, but they also produce the highest share of Black professionals that graduate out of any college in the United States, including medical doctors, engineers, dentists, the list goes on and on and on. One out of every five Black students graduates from an HBCU. And so these schools have meaning, they have purpose. They're producing results, not just for Black America, but for America in general. And so we want to applaud the president's efforts on HBCUs. But I think sometimes Black people get a little nauseated and feel like they're experiencing whiplash when the president introduces an executive order like this that seems good on its face, right? And yet, in the same breath and with the same stroke of a pen, he signs an executive order that essentially nullifies the reason for their existence. The second executive order is called Restoring Equality of Opportunity and Meritocracy. Here is a clip of the president signing this executive order.
Lastly, sir, we have an executive order on disparate impact theory. This is a theory that underlies a lot of the modern DEI and CRT-driven diversity culture. The basic idea here is instructing your departments and agencies to no longer rely on disparate impact theory as they're regulating, as they're issuing guidance, as they're making rules. We want to focus on results. We want to focus on actual fairness. We want to focus on merit, not things like disparate impact theory and the whole sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion cult.
It's getting out of that, huh?
Yes, sir.
After being in that jungle for a long time.
And so the name in and of itself, restoring equality of opportunity and meritocracy, is a little concerning to me because, firstly, unfortunately, equality is really not a lived experience for people here. Now, that doesn't mean that equality is not something that we should strive for. We should absolutely strive for it because we know that God created all of us in his image and in his likeness, right? But so even though equality is in the name, we know that everyone is not treated equally, right? You can look across human civilization and see how different racial groups, not just in America, but elsewhere, different classes, nationalities, sects of tribes, etc., are treated differently. And unfortunately, merit is subjective to the person defining it. What one appears to be merit worthy or merit based, another might kind of just shrug their shoulders at. So to me, merit is being able to survive the streets of Southeast DC or Chicago. And although you've never had a prestigious internship, you knew how to navigate those streets, right? You thrived by developing negotiation skills, character development skills. You knew survival tactics, and that is beneficial on many jobs. And so to me, merit might look different to you because of how you grew up or because of your lived experience. And so merit is subjective. And so this new executive order is targeting a phenomenon that implies that merit is the only standard that we should meet when, again, merit is completely subjective to the eyes of the beholder. But it targets something called, it's a phenomenon called disparate impact. And so disparate impact seeks to ensure that programs that accept federal money are not administered in a way that perpetuates the repercussions of past discrimination. And so the Supreme Court has explained that even benignly motivated policies that appear neutral on their face may be traceable to the nation's long history of racial discrimination. And so there's been tons of research done on disparate impact that demonstrates something called implicit or unconscious bias that is a very real thing that we experience in the world. And it's a widespread problem that disproportionately negatively affects Black people across the diaspora. And this bias precludes Blacks from advancing in society, from advancing in the economy, from advancing in the workplace. And so there were some regulations that were codified in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so the president is looking to strip some of this language in these regulations, and he's calling on different departments to review their laws pertaining to disparate impact. And this specific order falls in line with what Trump is calling a colorblind society that's based on meritocracy. And so now the problem that I'm looking at through the lens of truth is that the HBCU executive order assumes that inequities exist, right? And it seeks to correct for historical disadvantages based on race, which is what HBCUs were created for. They were created to right many of these wrongs. And HBCUs are still very much needed because even though that there are lots of other institutions, African Americans typically are blocked from many of these institutions because of something called an admissions test, like whether it's the SAT or the ACT. Many of these tests, too, through research, have been shown to be not indicative of what somebody knows, but indicative of how much money somebody has and how well they studied on those tests. But those tests negatively are affecting access for Black students in colleges and universities. And so you have this HBCU executive order that acknowledges that there are some disadvantages based on race. Then you have this disparate impact and meritocracy executive order that opposes any policy that treats individuals differently based on race. And so I guess what I'm trying to figure out is you could have this race conscious policy and this policy that basically is saying we can't have race conscious policy. We need a colorblind approach to policymaking. I'm trying to figure out which one we want, right? Can we make this make sense? And even as I'm talking about it, I don't know that we can make this make sense because either we believe racial disparities exist or they don't. And the policy would be consistent across the board. Now, I would love to live in a colorblind society. I really would. A colorblind society where I'm not treated differently based on race, where the next person is not treated differently based on their nationality or their tribe or where they were born based on geography, because we know that God is not a respecter of persons, right? But we also know that we live in a fallen world. And unfortunately, this world has labeled people based on group identity, and it stereotypes them and it judges them and it oppresses them, right? And there are still lingering effects to this historical oppression. There is residue, just like after an earthquake. What happens after an earthquake? There is residue through aftershocks and tremors. And so we are still living in those tremors. And so, how do we reconcile policy to align with truth while not allowing it to become this slippery slope, which then precludes anybody from getting access to things like prestigious institutions or access to jobs? This really is the question of the millennium for me. How do we acknowledge that oppression and bias and unconscious, sometimes conscious bias exist? But how do we recognize that these racial inequities exist? Stop perpetuating them and then create a society that is truly equal for everybody. Not one race, not one group, not one class, but for everybody. So you pray and I'll pray, and we will stand in the gap and just believe God that this is going to happen in our lifetime. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you will subscribe, share this video, and do your own research on these issues and on these new executive orders. Take care and God bless.